The laughter inside the garage was the last thing anyone expected. It wasn't loud or carefree. It was small, private. The kind of laugh a man lets slip when his hands remember how to turn a stubborn bolt that once refused to move. Grease-lined Gus Reyes's knuckles, and the single light above his workbench hummed with an electric buzz. Outside, Brooklyn's winter night pressed hard against the thin garage door, snowflakes rattling like impatient fingers. Then footsteps, quick, excited, heels tapping against cracked pavement. The door burst open, letting in a rush of cold air and perfume, a collision of two worlds. "Dad!" Vivian's voice cut through the night, alive with the kind of joy that made her seem 12 again instead of 26. Her cheeks glowed pink from the wind, her eyes bright as if the city itself had given her its fire. She held something in her hand, something small but radiant. Gus straightened slowly, vertebrae popping in protest, and wiped his hands on a rag that had long surrendered to oil stains. He didn't need to ask what she carried. The way she clutched it told the whole story. "He asked," she whispered, breathless, as if speaking it too loudly might shatter the fragile magic. Then she opened her palm. A ring glittered under the harsh fluorescent light, a diamond large enough to blind the unprepared. For a moment, Gus only stared. The Harley he had been restoring sat unfinished beside them, chrome dull under layers of dust, wires trailing loose like veins left open. It was a relic of another time, a promise to himself he never had the money, or maybe the courage, to finish. Now the ring sparkled against it, mocking the smallness of his world. Jasper proposed. Vivian's smile widened, trembling at the edges. "We're getting married in April." April. Too soon. The word caught in Gus's chest like grit in an engine. He forced his face into something resembling happiness. "April, huh? That's fast." "When you know, she said, almost chanting Jasper's words, her voice carrying their rhythm. She pressed the ring closer to his face, eager for his approval, for him to share her wonder. Gus leaned in, studying it with a mechanic's eye. Perfect cut, immaculate clarity, the kind of ring you bought to be seen, not to be felt. He thought of Maria's ring, plain, modest, bought after 3 extra shifts at the shop. Yet it had never dulled, never lost its fire, because it carried something no jeweler could sell: devotion. Vivian slipped the ring back onto her finger, light dancing across her skin. "He wants you to meet him tomorrow. Dinner. Just the 3 of us." Gus nodded, though unease crawled over him like cold sweat. The Harley loomed behind him, unfinished, silent. Vivian's laughter still hung in the air, but now it sounded fragile, as if a wrong word might splinter it. He smiled anyway, because that's what fathers do when their daughters look at them with hope. Inside, though, he felt the first quiet tremor of a storm. The restaurant was the kind Gus had only ever passed by, never entered. Golden light spilled through tall windows, reflecting on polished black cars lined up at the curb. Inside, he imagined, the air would smell of money. Truffles shaved by waiters in white gloves, wine older than Vivian herself. He stood in front of his closet instead, staring at the navy suit he hadn't worn since her college graduation. The shoulders were a little tighter now, the fabric faintly shiny where it had been pressed too often. He brushed at a crease that refused to flatten, then sighed. The clock ticked louder than usual. Tomorrow he'd meet Jasper face to face, but tonight he was alone with his thoughts. Gus sat at his kitchen table, the wood worn smooth where Vivian had done her homework years ago, where Maria used to hum as she made arroz con pollo. A picture frame rested by the salt shaker. Maria in her wedding dress, her smile a promise that had carried him through deployments, layoffs, and the long ache of raising a daughter alone. "She says he's everything she's dreamed of," Gus murmured to the photo. "But dreams can trick you, Maria. You know that." The house groaned with the winter wind, settling around him like an old coat. Outside, the neighborhood pulsed with familiar sounds. Kids laughing too loud on the sidewalk, Mrs. Rodriguez's television drama blaring through the thin walls, a dog barking at shadows. It was noisy, imperfect, alive. Jasper, Gus knew, came from silence, the kind money buys. Silence padded by doormen, thick carpets, and vacations spent in countries where no one knows your name but everyone knows your credit card. Gus had glimpsed it once on Vivian's phone. Photos of Jasper with his arm draped around her like a claim, standing beside a scarlet sports car. Captions about winning and leveling up. Comments filled with fire emojis and hollow praise. Gus had scrolled until his hands shook. One post still gnawed at him. Some people are content with ordinary lives. Not me. Beneath it, Jasper's friends had cheered him on digital backslaps of ambition. Ordinary lives. That's what Gus had given Vivian. Peanut butter sandwiches, subway rides, second-hand bikes he fixed up himself. Ordinary, but safe. Ordinary, but filled with love. And now it felt like Jasper had stepped into that life not to cherish it, but to erase it. He pushed the phone away and rubbed the back of his neck. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe Jasper was just nervous in front of strangers, better than he looked online. Still, unease throbbed inside him. Gus stood, walked to the small hallway mirror, and adjusted his tie. The reflection staring back wasn't the man he once was. A soldier, strong and certain. It was a man with tired eyes and grease still faintly under his nails. Would Jasper see that and dismiss him, like a stranger on the street? The thought made his jaw tighten. Tomorrow, Gus decided he'd look Jasper in the eye. Not as a mechanic. Not even as a father. But as a man who'd spent his life fighting for respect the hard way. And if Jasper thought that made him ordinary, then Jasper had no idea what ordinary could endure. The Golden Fork didn't feel like a restaurant. It felt like a cathedral. Chandeliers hung like constellations overhead, their crystals catching fire in the amber glow. Glassware sparkled at every table, each stem so thin it looked like one wrong breath might shatter it. Conversations murmured in practiced tones, laughter rising and falling like a rehearsed symphony. Gus paused at the entrance, the chill from outside still clinging to his suit. A hostess, too polished to smile sincerely, gave him a look that measured his worth in a single second. His collar suddenly felt too tight. "Dad!" Vivian rose from a corner booth, her voice carrying a brightness that cut through the hush. She looked stunning, radiant in a way that reminded him of Maria on their wedding day. And beside her, Jasper. The man barely looked up from his phone before offering Gus a handshake across the table. Smooth palm, soft grip, a smile that was more performance than welcome. "Mr. Reyes," Jasper said. His tone as cool as the marble floor beneath them. "Finally. I've heard so much." "Likewise." Gus sat down, the leather seat swallowing him whole. Vivian squeezed his hand quickly under the table, a silent plea for peace. "Isn't this place amazing?" Jasper thought it would be perfect for tonight. The waiter arrived without being summoned, already holding a bottle of Bordeaux. Jasper nodded, dismissing any need for discussion. "This vintage will do," he said, gesturing as though wine were currency and he was a banker. Gus cleared his throat. "I'm more of a beer man." Vivian laughed nervously. "Dad, just try it. You might like it." The wine was poured. Gus lifted the glass, caught his reflection in its deep red swirl, and set it back down untouched. Jasper leaned forward, elbows perfectly balanced on the table. "Vivian tells me you work with your hands. A mechanic, right? Must be satisfying to see something broken. Then, what? Patch it back together." The word patch carried the weight of an insult disguised as curiosity. "I fix things," Gus replied evenly. "Cars, bikes, sometimes people's days, when they break down on the side of the road." "Ah!" Jasper's laugh was a blade wrapped in silk. "Useful. Though, in my field, we prefer to build portfolios, not patch tires. Higher returns." Vivian's smile faltered. She glanced at her father, then at Jasper, as though silently willing both men to bend before the moment snapped. The waiter slipped the check onto the table after a blur of courses Gus hardly tasted. Jasper didn't glance at it. He slid it across the table toward Gus with deliberate slowness. "I believe tradition says the bride's father covers this one," he said. Gus looked down at the total, $347. His heart hammered. A month's groceries, the electric bill, Vivian's hopeful eyes across the table. "Dad, don't." she whispered. But Gus already knew. Pride was heavier than the number inked on that slip. He reached into his wallet, the leather worn thin from decades of use, and set his card on the table. Jasper leaned back, triumphant. And in that quiet, with wine glasses chiming and strangers laughing around them, Gus felt something harden in his chest. Not humiliation, but resolve. Tonight wasn't about the bill. Tonight was about the measure of a man. And he knew Jasper had just failed the test. The subway ride back to Brooklyn rattled like a confession Gus couldn't voice. He sat stiff in his suit, the receipt from the Golden Fork folded tight in his pocket, a paper cut across his pride. Vivian leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, her perfume still faintly mixed with Jasper's cologne. "Dad?" she murmured, eyes closed as if the world was too heavy. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. Gus didn't answer. The roar of the train filled the silence between them. He watched his reflection in the darkened window. Creased face, tired eyes. A man who had worked his whole life so his daughter would never feel less than anyone else. Tonight, that work had been dismissed with a smirk and a swipe of a credit card. Back home, the house seemed smaller, quieter. Vivian followed him inside, kicking off her heels by the door. She looked out of place in this modest kitchen, wearing a dress that belonged under chandeliers, not a single overhead bulb buzzing faintly. "Dad, say something." Her voice cracked, and suddenly she wasn't 26 anymore. She was 8 years old, standing in front of him with scraped knees, waiting for reassurance. Gus set his jacket across the back of a chair. "Vivian, I need you to really think about tonight. The way he spoke to me. The way he slid that check like he was testing me." Her arms wrapped around herself. "You don't understand him. He's under so much pressure at work, and he wants everything to be perfect. He wants to impress people. By humiliating me?" Gus's tone was low but sharp. "By mocking the life that raised you? Is that how he impresses people?" Vivian blinked fast, tears gathering. "He's never been cruel to me, Dad. He's always been sweet, thoughtful. You just saw the worst side of him. That worst side," Gus said slowly, "is who a man really is when he thinks no one can stop him." She shook her head, stepping back as though distance could shield her. "You're judging him too quickly. You don't know him like I do. And maybe you don't either," Gus said, his voice softer now, heavy with sorrow. Vivian turned away, staring at the family photos lining the wall. Birthday parties with paper hats. High school graduation. A trip to the lake with Maria's smile frozen forever in the background. Her breath shuddered. "Do you think I've made a mistake?" Gus's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her yes, to rip the ring from her finger, to lock the door and keep her safe. But he also knew love couldn't be forced, and mistakes couldn't always be prevented. "I think," he said carefully, "that love should never make you ashamed of where you come from." Vivian's hand trembled at her side. She stared at the diamond, its cold fire flickering. "He said tonight was about family," she whispered. "But why did it feel like a test I didn't know I was taking?" Gus didn't move closer. He let her sit with the question because the answer had to be hers. Outside, the neighborhood murmured its familiar chorus. Dogs barking, neighbors laughing, the clatter of dishes. Ordinary sounds. The kind of life Jasper had dismissed, but the kind of life Gus knew was worth protecting. And in the silence between father and daughter, something shifted. Vivian's certainty, once unshakable, now cracked just enough for doubt to take root. The storm was coming. April sunlight streamed across the garden, catching the lace of Vivian's gown and making her look almost otherworldly. Gus stood at the edge of the reception, his navy suit pressed, his shoes polished, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. The ceremony had passed in a blur. Vivian's vows trembling but determined, Jasper's delivery flawless, almost rehearsed. Now came the celebration, the part where masks slip and true selves emerge. Gus found his place card near the back, among distant relatives and strangers. He smiled politely, but his eyes never left Vivian. She floated between tables like a bird unsure of her cage, glowing but restless. Jasper shadowed her, hand firm at her waist, steering her as if the day belonged to him. Dinner was announced, and guests began to sit. Gus approached his table when a voice, smooth as polished stone, called out, "Mr. Reyes, please, sit with us up front. Your family now." Jasper stood by a head table, eyes glittering. For a moment, Gus felt a flicker of surprise. Maybe the boy was trying. He walked forward, the sound of chatter quieting as people watched. Jasper stepped aside with a gracious smile, his hand tugging at a chair. But as Gus lowered himself, weight committed, Jasper yanked it back. The fall was brutal and fast. The polished wood floor met him with a crack that rattled his bones. Gasps tore through the reception. Glasses stilled, forks clattered. For one suspended second, the world held its breath. "Careful there!" Jasper's voice rang clear, smooth but edged with triumph. "Age sneaks up on us all. Maybe you're more comfortable on the floor anyway." The cruelty was naked now. No disguise, no excuse. Vivian's cry sliced through the silence. She was on her knees beside Gus, her dress pooling around them. "Dad, are you hurt?" He winced, pushing himself up with her help. Around them, whispers rippled, guests staring, some with pity, others with outrage. Gus steadied himself on trembling legs, but his eyes never left Jasper. The boy's smile faltered, as if realizing too late that the cruelty had been too public, too raw to be excused as an accident. Vivian turned, her face pale, her voice shaking. "You did that on purpose." Jasper's laugh was thin. "Don't be ridiculous." He tripped. "Don't lie to me." Her words cut like glass. The garden seemed to close in. Even the string quartet faltered, bows hanging midair. Gus touched Vivian's shoulder lightly. "Princess," he whispered. "Look at him. Look at what he just showed you." Her breath hitched. For months she had defended him, explained him, made excuses for him. But the evidence now lay plain before her. The arrogance, the disdain, the calculated humiliation. Tears spilled down her cheeks, streaking her makeup. She slipped the ring from her finger, the diamond catching the April sun one last time before she let it fall onto the table with a sound sharper than any glass shattering. The crowd exhaled as one. Vivian's voice broke, but it carried across the stunned silence. "I will not marry a man who shames the people I love." Jasper's mask collapsed, his composure cracking into something raw and ugly. But before he could speak, Vivian turned away, toward her father, toward the man who had stood steady through every storm. Gus straightened, bruised but unbroken, pride swelling not for his own vindication, but for the courage blooming in his daughter's eyes. The fall had been his. The choice was hers. And in that moment she chose. The reception broke apart like glass underfoot. Some guests avoided looking at Gus as they drifted back to their conversations, desperate to smooth over the fracture. Others, braver, shook his hand, murmuring shame at what they'd witnessed. But Gus hardly heard them. His world had narrowed to Vivian's trembling hand in his and the sound of her breath catching in the aftermath. She stood in her mother's altered gown, lace trembling with every heartbeat. "I thought love meant holding on," she whispered, voice raw. "But maybe sometimes it means letting go." Gus wanted to answer, to give her wisdom carved from his scars. But instead he simply squeezed her hand. There were no lessons tonight, only the truth she had already seen. Jasper was gone before the band struck another note. No scene, no farewell. Just the quiet retreat of a man who had spent his whole life winning games and had finally discovered one he couldn't control. His absence was louder than his presence had ever been. The sun sagged lower, gilding the edges of the garden in gold. Vivian's friends hovered nearby, offering tissues, soft words, fragile smiles. But it was Gus who she leaned on, his arm steady around her shoulders, as if she were once again a child learning to walk. "Let's go home," he said simply. The taxi ride was silent, broken only by the hum of the city and the occasional sniffle from Vivian. Gus didn't press her. The world had just cracked open beneath her feet. The pieces needed time to fall before she could begin to rebuild. Brooklyn greeted them with familiar noise, Neighbors calling goodnight across stoops, the bark of a restless dog, the low rumble of a passing train. Ordinary sounds. The kind of life Jasper had mocked, but the kind that now wrapped itself around Vivian like a bomb. Inside the house, Gus hung his suit jacket on the same chair where Maria's had once rested. He boiled water for tea while Vivian sat at the kitchen table, staring at the framed photo of her mother in her wedding dress. She would have hated him, Vivian said at last, her voice trembling but steadier than before. Gus placed the mug in front of her, steam curling upward like a prayer. She would have wanted you safe. That's all. Vivian traced the rim of the cup. I feel stupid. No, he shook his head firmly. You feel human, and you saw the truth before it was too late. That takes strength. Silence settled, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind that lets grief breathe. Later, when the tea had cooled and the neighborhood lights had dimmed, Vivian leaned her head on Gus's shoulder. Thank you for catching me when I fell. Gus looked at her, startled. Princess, you caught yourself. I just stood close enough to make sure you landed on your feet. She smiled faintly, eyes closed, exhaustion pulling her under. Gus sat still, holding her hand as the night deepened. Outside, spring wind rattled the window, but inside the old house, the air was calm. He touched the wedding band that still hung on the chain around his neck. She's safe, Maria, he thought. She's safe and she's stronger than ever. And for the first time in years, Gus felt the ache in his chest ease. Not because the storm had passed, but because his daughter had learned to stand in it. The night whispered through the streets, ordinary and eternal, carrying them both toward a tomorrow untouched by cruelty, but marked forever by courage. All right,